Welcome. My name is Sherida Phibbs, and I am thrilled to have you join us today for the second session of our four-part sourdough adventure. I do want to address a question that came up last month, and I promise to respond to. Now, the question was about gluten-free sourdough. Now, I personally do not have any experience with gluten-free baking, so I did a bit of research. And what I found is that, yes, you can be using the processes that I'm sharing with you during these presentations for the most part. And for additional information on sourdough gluten-free baking, all you have to do is do some Google searches, and I recommend looking at the King Arthur Flour website for their gluten-free information. Now, a little bit about us and what we do. We are the University of California Cooperative Extension Master Food Preservers, and we are with the San Joaquin County program. We are a dedicated team of volunteers who are passionate about food preservation and food safety. We do not endorse or recommend any specific brands or manufacturers of the products that we demonstrate or we mention in our presentations. Our focus is purely on sharing unbiased information to help you preserve food safely and successfully. For those who were not with us last month or did not watch the first session's presentation, let me just briefly go over this four-part presentation. Now, session one, for those who missed it, I encourage you to watch the 40-minute recording of that presentation on our website. We dove into the fascinating science of sourdough fermentation. We learned about the natural processes that make sourdough unique. We also covered essential equipment, ingredients, and supplies that is needed to start your own culture. And we spoke about the different flour types and how to keep it fresh and the concerns about cross-contamination. Now today, in this session, we're going to learn how to craft our sourdough starter from scratch. I'm also going to show you how to work with dehydrated starters, and I'm going to give you tips on maintaining your starter. I want you to keep it healthy and active. Now in session 3, our third session, we're going to focus on crafting breads, muffins, and more using your sourdough culture. We're also going to explore some creative discard ideas to ensure that absolutely nothing goes to waste. And then in session 4, it's going to be interactive. It's our final session. We're going to celebrate on baking triumphs. I want you to share your successes. And we'll also tackle any challenges that you've encountered with a troubleshooting segment to help you perfect your sourdough baking skills. So thank you for being here, and let's get started. So today's agenda in detail, we're going to revisit the science of sourdough. We're going to look at the recommended equipment and supplies that are needed to make your culture, the flours that we're going to use, some water tips, how the temperature affects the sourdough, the process of starting that new culture, and how to maintain it. We're going to also dig a little bit deeper into dehydrated starters, look at when things go bad, and do some troubleshooting tips. I want you to imagine having a magic potion in your kitchen that turns simple flour and water into delicious, flavorful bread. And that's essentially what a sourdough starter is. It's a living mixture of flour and water. It's home to a stable community of beneficial bacteria and wild yeast. And by regularly feeding this mixture with more flour and water, we keep it alive and thriving. This starter is the heart and the soul of sourdough baking. And for home bakers, especially those dealing with varying ambient temperatures in our kitchens, mastering the care and the use of a sourdough starter is crucial. It is the secret to creating bread with the perfect flavor, texture, and long-lasting freshness. We are going to revisit what a sourdough starter is right now. So I want you to imagine yeast and bacteria as friendly neighbors, and they rely on each other for survival. Their favorite food is flour. The yeast, it turns the flour into carbon dioxide gas bubbles, and that's what makes the dough rise. And it produces more yeast as well. And the bacteria, it turns the flour into sugar for the yeast. And they also create that tangy acids that contribute to the bread's unique taste. Now together, they add a variety of flavor compounds to the bread. And in sourdough starter, you're going to find many different species of bacteria and yeast all working together. And every starter is unique. A starter only needs 2 ingredients, flour and water. You're going to find that there are recipes or other bakers who also add honey, sugar, apple juice, etc. But this is not necessary, and I discourage this practice. Now, the equipment we need to make our sourdough culture is 2 starter jars with lids. Now, you can use a wide mouth 1-quart mason jar with a lid or a food-safe clear glass canister with a lid. Now, for the canister or WEC jars, using the glass lid without the provided rubber seal, it creates just enough of a seal to keep the moisture and the heat trapped in. And this is crucial for maintaining that right environment for fermentation. Please do not cover your starters with coffee filters, cheesecloth, or paper towels, because your starter will tend to dry out. Now, to track the rise of your starter, you can place an elastic band around the jar at the level of your starter after feeding it. This provides a very clear visual reference for how much your starter expands between refreshments. A rigid spatula to stir and scrape inside of the jar is needed. Now, I like using a 1-piece rigid silicone spatula. I like the 1-piece as it's easier to clean. Also, what's very important is a scale with metric units. It measures grams, and it has a tare function. And a kitchen scale is indispensable for accurate measurements when refreshing your starter and making your dough. And unlike measuring by volume, which can be imprecise due to the variations in how flour packs into a cup, using a scale, it ensures you get the exact amount of flour needed every time. And getting accustomed to weighing your ingredients with a scale is also a great habit for improving your overall baking consistency. And precision in measurements, it leads to better and more predictable results, making your baking endeavors more successful and enjoyable. Now, the tare function on a kitchen scale, it allows you to reset the scale to 0 after placing a container or any other item on it. This way, you can measure the weight of the ingredients without including the weight of the container. So for those who are not familiar with the tare function, this is how it works. You place your empty container on the scale. You press the tare button, which will reset the display to 0. And you add your ingredient to the container. Now the scale will only show you the weight of the ingredient and not the container. And this function is extremely useful for achieving precise measurements and for simplifying the process of weighing multiple ingredients in the same container. Lastly is the instant read digital thermometer, and using an instant read digital thermometer is crucial for these reasons. The yeast, the driving force behind the sourdough fermentation, is sensitive to temperature, and you can kill your starter if it gets above 100 degrees or if you use water that is too warm. Now, an instant read thermometer can help you maintain that ideal temperature for your starter and also for your dough. And achieving consistent results in sourdough baking can be challenging due to variables like your room temperature and humidity. And a digital thermometer helps you measure that exact temperature of your starter and the dough. It allows you to make necessary adjustments to water temperature or your proofing time to achieve a consistent texture and flavor. And lastly, knowing the exact internal temperature of your bread can prevent under or over baking. And an instant read thermometer can help you when your bread has reached this point. It ensures a perfectly baked loaf every time. Now, other miscellaneous supplies you might need are a painter's tape and writing pen, paper towels, containers to put unusable discard in. This is your first 2 weeks of discard. You can use resealable plastic bags, discarded cottage cheese, or a discarded yogurt container, anything that you can toss out. Now, after the first 2 weeks, you might want to save usable discard, and you can use this discard in discard recipes. The one thing that I want to point out is you never, ever, ever, ever want to put any discard down your sink drain because you will clog the drain. Now, let's get started with our jars. The first thing we're going to do is we are going to clean and sterilize 2 glass jars and lids. And then I want you to allow the jars to thoroughly air dry. We're going to weigh each jar without the lid. And you're going to find that each jar will weigh differently. We're going to record the weight in grams on the painter's tape, place it on the bottom of the jar, or also you might just want to use a permanent marker to record it on the bottom of the jar. These are the various flours commonly used in sourdough bread starters. I recommend only using the unbleached and organic flours. And during this last month, I performed a starter experiment using 3 different flours and blends. I'll be sharing some visual validation as to why I highly recommend using the rye and bread flour or the whole wheat and bread flour blend. Now, I cannot recommend using only the whole wheat flour. And while some recipes suggest using 100% bread flour or 100% all-purpose flour, I advise against this as well. Those recipes have a high failure rate if you do not include whole wheat or rye flour. So why do we want to mix 2 types of flour? First, let's look at the whole wheat and the bread flour blend. Now, dormant wild yeast cells are naturally found on the outer shell or the hull of a wheat berry. And when whole wheat is milled, these yeast cells, along with their microbial companion, lactic acid bacteria, they end up in the flour. Now, in contrast, when refining all-purpose flour or bread flour, the hull and most beneficial microbes are removed. However, these refined flours, they convert into sugars more easily, which feeds the microbes in the whole wheat. So in your 50-50 flour blend, the whole wheat flour, it provides the necessary wild yeast and beneficial bacteria, while the bread flour supplies the majority of the food. This combination is perfect for growing a new starter. Now, the advantages of rye flour and bread flour blend. Rye flour, it contains a higher level of enzymes that break down complex sugars into simpler forms, making them more accessible to the yeast and the bacteria. It also introduces a variety of wild yeast and bacteria. It adds to the complexity and the depth to the flavor of the sourdough. And the bread flour, like the first one that I explained to you in the whole wheat, it supplies most of the food. And this combination is perfect for growing a new starter. So to get started, we want to prepare 800 grams of flour blend and place it in an airtight container. So with the whole wheat and the bread flour blend, we're going to blend 50% wheat and 50% flour. That would be 400 grams of whole wheat and 400 grams of bread flour. Now with your mix of rye and bread, it's 25% of the rye and 75% of the bread. That means we're going to take 200 grams of rye flour and 600 grams of bread flour. We're going to place it into an airtight container, making sure that there is enough space where we can blend these flours together so it's perfectly blended and mixed in well together. Now, our water choice can make a difference as well. And when making a successful starter, it may come down to the quality of your water. High levels of chlorine or chloramine in your tap water, it can disrupt the fermentation. Now, remember, their job is to destroy bacteria, and we do not want to kill our lactic acid bacteria. You may want to check with your city water source and see if they use chlorine or chloramine. Now, to remove chlorine, very simply, the night before you start your starter, you can fill a large jug with tap water and leave it uncovered overnight. And this allows your chlorine to evaporate. However, if your city uses chloramine instead of chlorine, this method won't work because chloramine doesn't dissipate as easily. So I did a little bit of research and I found that chloramine can be filtered using a granular activated carbon, that's a GAC. And the carbon, it absorbs and neutralizes the chloramine. So you want to ensure that the filter is rated for chloramine removal, as not all of the activated carbon filters can effectively remove chloramine. I also read that you might be able to use vitamin C, adding it to your water, and boiling water can also remove chlorine and chloramine. But with chloramine, you have to boil it longer, like over an hour. So I recommend that you do some more research if you have to use something to remove chloramine. I personally use the filter that's in my refrigerator, and I have no problem with my city water. So here's some recommended water choices and why it's important. You can use clean spring water because it contains the essential minerals like magnesium, calcium, and sodium. And these minerals, they contribute to the health of your sourdough. And also filtered tap water is a good choice. Now, you want to stay away from distilled water and reverse osmosis water because those lack the minerals. And you will find that you won't have as much success with your sourdough starters if you use distilled or water that has been ran through reverse osmosis. Now, I think the most common problem with sourdough is not creating a strong starter. And this happens either by not understanding the process or being too impatient to start using the culture. Let me use this analogy to help illustrate the importance of building a strong starter. Imagine you're trying to build a campfire, And using a good, strong, and active sourdough starter is like having dry, well-seasoned wood and a powerful lighter or a match to start that fire. And with these tools, your fire catches quickly, it burns brightly, and it produces consistent warmth and light. Now, on the other hand, using a weak or inactive sourdough starter is like trying to start your campfire with damp wood and a weak spark. Now, the wood might smolder and you might eventually get some flames, but the fire is going to be inconsistent, it's going to be hard to manage, and it won't provide the warmth and the light that you need. So, just as a good fire needs strong, dry wood and a reliable way to ignite it, good bread needs a robust, active starter to rise properly, develop its flavor, and achieve the right texture. And building your starter, it takes time and patience. Some say it's possible to have a starter that's ready in a few days to 2 weeks. However, I recommend that you give it a good 4 weeks because each starter culture is unique and it may develop quicker or it may take longer. And during this time, it is a daily 5-minute commitment. And after you build a strong starter, you can then store it in the refrigerator and feed it when you bake. I personally bake every 1 or 2 weeks, and I only feed my starter when I bake. And you can tailor the feeding schedule to work with you as well. That way, there is minimal time and minimal flour that is needed. Now, keeping a log is important, and this schedule also provides you with the information needed to start and feed your starter. Now, the first 10 to 14-day period is building that starter, and the next 2 weeks, you will be strengthening your starter. The log, it helps you to stay on track, and after the first 2 weeks, it also allows you to learn about your starter. By keeping a log, you're going to learn how ambient temperature and feeding ratios affect when your starter peaks. And being aware of how long it takes to peak at a particular feeding ratio and ambient temperature, it allows you to adjust your feeding time and your feeding ratios to when you want to start your dough making process. This is already available on our website. You have already prepared your 800 grams of your flour blend. And to create your initial mix, you're going to first place your jar on the scale and bring it to 0. So I hit the tare button. Next, I'm going to place 75 grams of water into my jar. And hit the tare button to bring it back to 0. And now I'm going to place 75 grams of my flour blend. I'll then give it a really, really good stir. And you're going to find that it is a thick consistency. Now, this step, it hydrates the flour and it reactivates the dormant yeast cells and the lactic acid bacteria. And this is all naturally present in the flour that we have. See how thick that paste is. You do not want anything thinner than that. Now I'm going to scrape down the sides of the jar is I want as much down into the paste mixture as possible. I would clean the rim if it got dirty. I'm going to place that lid on top, set it in the room where it is at least 68 to 78 degrees. Never ever sit it in the sun, and do not put it in your oven. So there's going to be no feeding during day 2 and 3. I want you to take a good look at your starter each day. You may see some bubbling activity, which is a good sign. This is the initial activity surge. You may see some bubbles. I don't want you to be discouraged if you don't see it. Just stay with the course. You may even see and notice some expansion. This is not an indication that your starter is ready to use. This is the process where the bad microorganisms are burning off the flour. Now, it's going to take us several days for the bad organisms to flush out. And during this time, the yeast population is slowly building and the pH is dropping. And you may even find an unpleasant smell. And however, this is normal. Now, looking at these pictures in day 2, as you can see, we're starting to get a little bit of activity, and they all still smell like flour paste. Now, the ambient temperature in my kitchen is 77 degrees. Now, day 3, the rye mix is showing the most activity. And the third jar, which is only the whole wheat, has very little activity. Now, things can go bad. Mold spores are everywhere. And when creating a new starter, there's always a risk of bad mold growth until the starter is fully established, which usually takes about 10 days to 2 weeks. So keep an eye out for the mold on the surface of your starter or the sides of your jar. You're going to look for fuzzy gray or green mold, or you can see red or orange streaks in your paste. And when you find it, you need to throw it out and start over with a clean, sterilized jar and equipment. Now, don't confuse mold with what we see with whole wheat flour. You can see black specks, and it might have a pinkish hue due to the red wheat. You can also see forming white bubbles on the surface, and it might turn dark brown when it dries out or it oxidizes, which can happen if you do not keep a lid on your starter. And remember, we are going to keep a lid on our starter, but we're not going to tighten it down all the way. Now, by day 4, you may not see any activity. But again, don't panic. It can be normal, or you might see even more activity. The yeast population is developing. It is now time to start our daily discard and our feeding routine. So these pictures are before I fed it. And as you can see, there is great activity with the rye bread mix and the whole wheat bread mix, and nothing with the whole wheat. Now, starting with day 4 and ongoing, this is our routine. We're going to heat our water to 80 degrees. We're going to place on the scale and weigh it. And we want to remove all but 25 grams of our starter. So we already know what the weight of our jar is because we've already weighed it. And we're going to add 25 grams to that. So in this case, that adds up to 429, but I'm going to use 430 to make it simple. Look how thin that starter is. It is, definitely not ready to use. I want to use 430, so I'm going to remove a little bit more. Here we go. Now, we're going to bring it to 0 by hitting that tare function. And we're feeding a ratio of 1 to 2. So now we're going to add 50 grams of water. Which is twice the amount of the remaining starter that we retained. Give it a really good stir. I want to incorporate all the remaining starter with the water and give it a really, really, really good stir. And then I'm going to add 50 grams of flour. This 1-to-2 ratio, which is 1 part starter, 2 parts flour, 2 parts water, is 100% hydration. I stirred it really well. I've scraped it down. I'm going to wipe the rim of my jar down. I don't want any of that on there. I don't want it to become crusty and yucky. And I'll place the lid on it, put the rubber band around it, and I'm now going to set it in a little slightly warmer area, which is 75 to 80 degrees. Again, never ever place it in the oven. Accidents happen, like turning the oven on to preheat it and you don't remember that it's there, or don't put it in the oven with a light on, because you're going to find that it may get over 100 degrees. And we remember we only want it between 75 and 80 degrees, preferably. Again, this is the routine for the remaining of the 30 days. I want you to use that log. I want you to take note of the ambient temperatures in your kitchen. The temperature affects fermentation. The warm ambient temperature, it gives a faster fermentation, and the cooler it is, it slows the process down. Periodically, you will want to transfer your starter into a clean, sterile jar. Now, this is how to tell if your starter is at its peak. See how much it has risen since it was fed? It is clear to the top of the canister. It has more than doubled its size. Now, in addition, the float test is a method used to determine if the sourdough starter is ready for baking. It involves dropping a small amount of the starter onto the water and observing whether it floats or sinks. If the starter floats, it indicates that there is enough gas produced by the yeast and the bacteria to make the bread rise. It suggests that the starter is ready to be used. However, the float test isn't always reliable, because both partially risen yeast dough, when it's still growing, can float in the water, and it can lead to a false positive. A more accurate way to assess its readiness is to check if the dough or the starter is at its peak and has a bubbly consistency. So why does that starter float? Well, it's because the yeast in the dough or the starter has produced tiny bubbles of carbon dioxide. And these bubbles, they get trapped within the glutinous web formed by the flour and the liquid. And it causes the dough or the starter to rise. It becomes lighter than the water, which allows it to float. You know, this process is essential for creating that light and airy sourdough bread. If after 2 weeks you do not see it rising by at least double, then it is not an active starter, and I want you to abort mission and start over. A starter is at its peak right before it starts to fall. So keep a log of when you feed it and when you see it rise to its peak, and then it starts to fall. Also, it's important to log the ambient temperature and the feeding ratio. So why do we discard? Well, we do not want to accumulate more starter and feed a large discard because it wastes flour. And do not save any discard to use during the first 2 weeks, as it still may contain some harmful bacteria. Collect it in a disposable container, throw it out, or you can even put it in your compost pile. Now, after 2 weeks, you can use your discard in various recipes. I have a few recipes to share with you at this time, like pancakes, waffles, crackers, and you're going to find those as well on our website. You will need to learn to read your starter. I don't want you to get impatient and feed it too soon. You only feed your starter when it's peaked and it's starting to fall. And if you feed before it peaks, you're going to weaken your starter as the yeast cells are still building. The starter goes through these stages. It's been recently fed, so it's been refreshed. Then there's the expansion stage when it starts rising in the container. It peaks when it has eaten all of its available food, and then it starts to fall. And it starts to deflate. And then it's completely fallen. It's deflated back to its original marker. It starts to get hungry, and you're going to see fewer bubbles, and it's becoming thinner. And then it starts starving, and it smells horrid, and the hooch develops. And you're going to feed where it's highlighted in yellow, where it's falling or it has fallen. Never feed before and never feed after it's fallen, when it's hungry. Also, when refrigerating your starter, you can increase your ratio to best work to how often you will bake and want to feed it. Now, I keep my established starter refrigerated. I feed it when I bake, which is typically every 2 weeks. I find with my starter, a 1:3:3 ratio works fine for me. So we are making 100% hydrated starter, which when you're saying 100% hydration, that means the same flour and water ratio. And we've been feeding it a 1:2 ratio, which is 1 part of your existing starter, which is 25 grams, 2 parts of flour, which is 50 grams, and 2 parts water, which is 50 grams. So now we've made 125 grams of starter. Now, during your maintenance process and during the last 2 weeks of making your starter, if you find your starter is starving between feedings, I want you to increase it to a 1:3:3 ratio. And why can this happen? Well, it can happen because your kitchen is warmer. So the ambient temperature is warmer, which then creates faster fermentation. And faster fermentation means that the starter is eating its sugars faster. So you can feed it a 1:3:3, 1:4:4, 1:5:5 ratio, whatever works to keep it from starving, because you do not want your starter to starve. You want to build yeast cells. You don't want to build more bacteria. And that's good bacteria, because it starts smelling and it becomes more acidic. And we just don't want that. We want we want more yeast cells because we want a better rise in our bread. So if you find that your starter's starving, increase it now to 133. So that's 1 part starter, which is your 25 grams of starter, leftover starter, 3 parts of water, which now we're going to use 75 grams, 3 parts water, which is 75 grams. Now we've made 175 grams of our starter. Once you have gone through all of the efforts of creating a very healthy and robust starter, periodically, you want to make your insurance backup. Your safety net is dehydrating it. So with your active starter, when it is at its peak, meaning it has its most yeast cells, spread 1/8 of an inch thick onto parchment paper or a silicone baking mat. Dry it at 85 to 90 degrees, but not hotter, because I don't want you to destroy the culture. So you can use a food dehydrator or the proof setting on your oven, but always test it with a thermometer to make sure that it is at the right temperature and not above the 90 degrees. Once it's thoroughly dry, you're going to crush it into fine powder and place it in a sealable bag. Place that bag into another airtight container, and you can store it in the freezer. This is also a great way to share your starter with others. Now, let's rehydrate it and wake up that starter. So we're going to take 10 grams of our dehydrated starter granules and 10 grams of 80 degrees water. And we're going to let it stand for about 30 minutes and let it hydrate. We're then going to add 40 grams of 80 degrees water and 40 grams of flour mix. And depending on the ambient temperature in your home, it may take 12 to 18 hours to start seeing bubbles forming. You now have 100 grams of starter. Start feeding your starter with your maintenance routine. I always do 2 or 3 days feeding, and I allow it to rest on the counter. I really want to wake up that culture before I use it for baking. Once it's awake and it's robust, I then will start storing it in the refrigerator again. Now, the flour and water paste is like a glue substance, and it's going to clog your drain. And cleaning crusty jars can be challenging. I found that if you remove as much as the starter with a spatula first, then use a paper towel to remove even more, it really makes a difference. I then fill the jar with soapy water and let it soak to soften the hardened starter. Then I gently pour out the liquid while catching the paste with a paper towel. I use a paper towel to wipe out the softened starter that's left in the jar. Wash the jar, and I always allow it to thoroughly air dry, and I sterilize it and air dry it before I use it again. Let's go into some troubleshooting now. Hooch, a sourdough starter, is a liquid layer that typically forms on top when the starter hasn't been fed for a while and it is starving. It's a mixture of water and alcohol that results from the fermentation process. Hooch is an indication that your starter is hungry, it's starving, and it needs to be fed. Also, in a couple of these pictures, you will also see some suspect mold. And if that's the case, I'd want to throw it out. Now, the other thing that jumps out to me is the crud buildup on the top of the jars in the first two pictures. Now, best practice would be to change out to a clean jar when feeding or stirring, and always wipe down the top of the rim with a paper towel. Now, the cause of hooch includes infrequent feedings. If the starter isn't fed regularly, it's going to consume all of the available sugars, and it's going to produce its byproduct, which is hooch. Now remember, a warmer environment, it accelerates the fermentation. It leads to quicker consumption of the food, and hooch may form. So if you find this is happening often, then you might want to consider increasing your feeding ratio. For instance, if you are feeding a 1-2-2, increase it to a 1-3-3. Now, I personally feed my mature starter every 2 weeks. I keep it in the refrigerator, and I feed it a 1-3-3 ratio. Now, hooch is not harmful. It is a natural part of the sourdough fermentation process. You can either stir it back into the starter or you can pour it off. Now, if you choose to stir it in, it can increase the sourness of your bread, giving it a more pronounced sourdough flavor. Now, this is because hooch contains alcohol, which is a byproduct of the yeast. It contributes to the tangy taste that sourdough is known for. So, stirring in the hooch can enhance the tangy profile of your bread, but if you prefer a milder flavor, you might opt to pour it off before feeding your starter. I pour it off. I don't want the hooch in my product. Ham yeast is a type of wild yeast that can sometimes form on the surface of fermented foods, including your sourdough starters. Now, ham yeast forms on many ferments once the sugar is used up and the pH drops due to the lactic acid production. It is characterized by a white, powdery, or foamy film, and it's different from mold, which is fuzzy and colored. Now, your cam yeast is not harmful. It doesn't require you to discard your entire sourdough starter. However, it can affect the flavor of your starter, giving it an unpleasant aroma. And if you notice cam yeast on your sourdough starter, you can simply skim it off with a clean spoon. And after removing it, you should transfer the remaining starter into a clean, sterilized jar and continue with your regular feedings. But if a small amount of cam yeast gets mixed back into the starter, it can be fine, but I want you to be aware that the starter may struggle with further cam yeast outbreaks. Now, in summary, encountering cam yeast on your sourdough starter doesn't mean you have to throw it out. Just remove the yeast, maintain good starter hygiene, and keep an eye on any changes in the starter smell or its appearance. Now, gray or green fuzzy mold on your sourdough starter is a type of fungus that can develop under certain conditions. Here's what you should know about. The gray or green mold typically looks discolored and fuzzy. It is similar to the mold you might find on old food. It is one of the signs that your starter has been contaminated and it is no longer safe to use. Let me repeat that. It is no longer safe to use. Now, this mold, it can occur if the starter's neglected or if it's become contaminated from unclean utensils, containers, or hands. It thrives in warm, moist environments, which is also ideal for the growth of your sourdough yeast. So keep your starter well fed and active. Only use clean utensils and containers. Wash your hands before handling the starter. And when not refreshing it daily, keep it in the refrigerator. If you notice gray or green mold, it's best to discard the entire starter. The mold spores can spread throughout the starter, even if they are not visible on the surface. Remember, while it's disappointing to lose a starter to mold, it is crucial to prioritize your health and safety. Always keep a backup of your starter and never hesitate to start a new one if you encounter mold. This infectious bacteria can appear in your sourdough starter. I can't even say it, and I'm not even going to begin to pronounce it. Now, this bacteria is recognized by its pink or reddish hues. And if you notice pink streaks or a film on the surface of the starter, it might be this bacteria. This bacteria can take advantage of underfed starters. When you neglect to feed your starter and the starter bacteria begins to overpower the weaker ones. And this can lead to the presence of this undesirable bacteria. So to prevent it, you always want to maintain regular feeding schedules. If you store it on the counter, make sure you feed it daily. If you don't feed it daily, make sure you refrigerate it. Use good hygiene. Keep your sourdough utensils and your containers clean. Wash your hands before handling the starter. And again, you always want to have a backup in case it happens. Now, your orange mold on sourdough starters is not the same bacteria. However, it is still harmful and you want to throw it out. So what is needed for baking is rice flour for sprinkling and proofing baskets. It helps it from sticking. Parchment paper or silicone bread sling, and that's for moving our dough to and from the baking vessel. We want a covered baking pan to trap the steam coming from the baking dough. That is the secret for the rise and the great crust. I personally use a cast iron Dutch oven, but if you don't already have one, you can be creative with what you already have in your kitchen, and I'll give you some ideas in just a few minutes. Just remember, it needs to be oven safe to 450 degrees Fahrenheit. We need a spray bottle to be used for misting the loaves with water just before baking. We need a silicone dough scraper. It works wonders when mixing your dough and removing that dough out of the container. A metal bench knife used for dividing the dough and tightening the loaves and moving the dough around when we're forming our doughs. We need a large clear glass bowl or something like that for mixing the bulk fermentation. We need a proofing basket. This could be a Banneton, which is a willow basket, or you can use what you have in your kitchen, like a basket, colander, or a bowl, and line it with a flour sack towel, but never a terry cloth towel. And then we need a way to keep our dough from drying out. I personally use disposable shower caps, which is the best thing since sliced bread, but you can use a plastic film of some type. We need an oven thermometer because you want to know what the actual temperature of your oven is. A bread knife for slicing up that yummy bread, and a lamb or a razor blade to score the bread before we bake it. So let's look at some ideas here. You can get these little kits that happens to have the bread slings and a lamb, a proofing basket, a bench knife, and a silicone spatula And this looks like a brush. If you already have a box cutter with snap-off blades or just a razor blade, it can be used instead of purchasing a sourdough bread lamb. And you can use a colander or maybe the dollar store colander and a flour sack towel. Use it as a proofing basket and save some money there. For baking, there are some choices. There's the expensive enamel-coated cast iron made for bread, but be careful because enamel-coated cast irons, the enamel will eventually start chipping in some of these Dutch ovens. I personally bake with an old cast iron Dutch oven, as we see here in the center, or even a roasting pan with the lid works well. Now, if you don't have any of that, we can get creative. We can use a pizza stone with an oven-safe pot, a cookie sheet with a stainless bowl over it. So you can get very creative as long as it's oven safe to 450 degrees. Join us for session 3. We're going to learn the process and the terminology of baking sourdough. I'll show you how to make English muffins, how to make easy beginner artisan type bread, how to make a sandwich loaf type bread. We'll look at discard recipes and go over again the recommended supplies and equipment.